Because it's Christmas, we are veering off once again for tangent number 13. Partly because Christianity's been doing really well in terms of everything I've thrown at it over the last couple of years. It's done a really good job. So today we're going to have a crack at one of the questions that would be a problem, assuming that Christianity could establish itself as being true in the first place, kind of just in case, that sort of thing. I have two of these basically, but today we're looking at the practical power of prayer, because in my head it just doesn't make any sense that God is like a genie and just handing out wonderful things for people who ask in the right way. To be fair, that's a little disingenuous. I don't actually think anyone thinks that's what's actually happening. But you do see some really odd stuff around prayer. I mentioned previously the journal my father started keeping the day he was diagnosed with cancer, and he kept that up until he died about 11 months later. And there's a lot of stuff about prayer in that. And I suppose to some extent this is sort of slightly foundational for this whole idea on prayer. As an example though, part of this includes a lady that comes to my dad to say, can I have some more specific details on your cancer so that I can more effectively target prayer? These are the words she used as relayed by the journal. To be fair, the book doesn't then dwell on that. It could have been that my dad's response was to flick her on the nose and say, that's not how prayer works, you silly old bat, and off we go. But either way, it surely cannot be linked with the success or failure of any prayerful endeavour, that it's down to the specificity of the requests made. I do get that specifics matter, as Brendan Fraser's character could attest in Bedazzled, but in this instance you'd think something along the lines of, dear God, please make it go away, would suffice in the context of a terminal cancer patient. So if we boil it down, in my head we get down to four core fundamental questions on the problems with prayer. The first one being, why would God change his mind just because we ask for something? Second one, how could anyone ask for anything for themselves when there are always others far worse off? Third one, if God answers some prayers and not others, which is, as I understand it, is the claim, does this not just suggest he's operating his own agenda and will only agree to yours if it happens to align with his? And last but not least, why does the format of prayer often seem to differ from the Lord's Prayer, which as I understand it is how Jesus taught humans they were to pray? The elephant in the room here would obviously be evidence, in the sense that if there were two people who are dying of some disease and I pray for one and not for the other, and the one I pray for survives and the other one doesn't, if that keeps happening, then we've got pretty conclusive proof that prayer works. In the interest of avoiding suspense, that is not a thing. These studies have been done and there are no results to show any indication that prayer actually works. In that, inevitably, though, it raises the question of what do you mean by works? I mean, in the case of praying for miracles, that sort of thing, they don't generally happen. And there are some evidence of medical miracles that people can't explain, but you also can't link up prayer to being the cause of them. It does, however, seem that there is some evidence for the benefit to the prayer, if not the prayee, which is where it gets interesting if you start to look at prayer in terms of some sort of meditation or gratitude ritual, and then it starts to make a bit more sense. I came across this brilliant quote from Soren Kierkegaard, or actually it should be Kierkegaard because it's double A. And he says, the function of prayer is not to influence God, but rather to change the nature of the one who prays. That definitely makes some sense in my head. You can see if Christianity were true, that would sort of make a lot of sense, I think. But it does beg the question, does the average Christian know? Interesting. And then you take it in the example of the lady asking my dad for more specific cancer details. Is she just widely miles off the mark in terms of a Kierkegaard sense, if he was right? Or is that just an example of what aligning one's inner self with some transcendent theological reality actually looks like practically? I'm not sure, and I do have to be a bit careful here because I'm still rather squirmy with Christianese, as it were, for want of a better word, and not for any good reason, mostly reasons that don't reflect on me very well, in that it feels like it's a little bit silly. I don't mean that, I don't think that intellectually, because I fully accept that Christianity may well be right. But instinctively, I sort of feel that. So I'm aware I have this inbuilt, hardwired bias against this stuff, which I have to be careful of when trying to reach an unbiased conclusion. Another really interesting angle to this is I keep coming across people who are a little bit hostile to Christians. I don't mean like Bond villain hostile, and not many of them, but there are some people who seem to have an objection to the existence of God on the basis that Christians are not necessarily behaving very Christianly. And this ties in really nicely to the idea of Kierkegaard, because if praying was good for the prayer, then Christians who've been doing that most of their lives should be getting better, should they not? And therefore, you should get to a point where a hypocritical, judgmental Christian shouldn't actually be possible to exist once you've been in the church for a certain length of time. Handily, though, I did find this fantastic quote which does a really nice job of addressing this. This comes from Nicky Gumbel, it's kind of fun to have that included here because he's actually randomly one of the unrelated few people who had some sort of influence on my trajectory, as it were, that's led to me ending up on YouTube. And he said, anyway, that churches are not museums that display perfect people. They are hospitals where the wounded, hurt, injured and broken find healing. And yes, obviously from that begs the question, it's like, well, if all these people are in this hospital for 30 years, 40 years, then is it not evidence for the lack of a healer if they're still a bit of an arsehole in 30 years down the road? But I found another quote which addresses this part really nicely as well. This comes from Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, apparently, who said that a Christian is not a good man. He is a vile wretch who has been saved by the grace of God. I gather the origins of that link up a little bit with the idea maybe of original sin, which would seem to be obviously ridiculous and I don't think is held by most Christians. But as I understand it, the church generally agrees with the idea that you can't earn your way into heaven by being good because we can't be good enough. Therefore, we're all fundamentally flawed, so no amount of prayer or going to church is actually going to turn anyone into the perfect Christian ideal anyway. So what to do with all that is difficult. I mean, I can definitely get on with the idea that a gratitude ritual and meditation and just humbling yourself before God, which seems to be very important, and I guess would make sense if God did exist, that humbling yourself before him would be a good idea. So I guess it comes down to some extent to what you ask for. For example, if I ask for a Lamborghini, it seems pretty unlikely I'm going to get that. But what about my dad's prayer to be healed? I mean, he was a good man, a devout Christian, a vicar, so he was out acting on it all the time. Flawed, obviously, but was certainly aware of his flaws and always trying to better himself and apologetic when we ran into them in everyday life. But he was dead at 51 years old. I suppose interesting, he did ask to be healed, it's in the journal, but he asked in the context of, if it is your will for me to be healed, then I would like that. It's almost like he's expressing, just in case, just a bit of information here in case you weren't aware, I don't want to die, quite like to see my grandkids, whatever. But he did caveat it that that was secondary to God's will and it should happen the way God wants it to do, and accepting of that. Beyond that, though, the kind and potentially deluded lady who asked for the medical details, it seems no matter how specific she got, it was not going to make any physical difference to the outcome. But you'd have to acknowledge that my dad bothered to record it in his journal, so it stuck with him to some extent, and maybe there was some sort of comfort for him in that. And potentially it's part of a lifelong ritual for her that means that she's on a trajectory as a better human being than she might have been in the absence of that, perhaps. You've got to say to some extent that's got to be her humbling herself before God, and that presumably could well be a positive thing for her and for the world, or anyone who interacts with her, whether God exists or not. Another interesting example in this is my aunt, who died 2 years ago today, as it happens, as I'm recording this. She was one of the best and kindest human beings ever to walk the earth, and again a devout Christian. When she was diagnosed with cancer, I had the dubious honour of being added to a group chat on Facebook, WhatsApp, where most of her social circle were Christians. So there was a lot of praying going on that I was able to see, including the statement that we believe in miracles and asking for one. Interestingly, that obviously doesn't sound like a terrible thing to be asking for, but in the context of all we've covered so far in the Bible and what would make sense, is the correct thing in that situation not to ask for God's will to be done and then to trust in God that whatever that outcome is, whether she lived or died, was the right outcome? That has got to be a difficult thing for anybody to ask for, but surely that's what makes the most sense. As a brief aside, I guess this also asks the question of the difference in theism and deism, and I was going to do a tangent on that at one point, but actually I don't think there's enough to really say on it. Deism just being the idea that God set up the universe and then disappeared and isn't active in the world. In that context, obviously prayer would make no sense at all because there'd be no one to pray to because he wouldn't be here and wouldn't be listening. But I think it's fair to say that some of the best evidence for the existence of God ties in with the historical case for the resurrection. Therefore, the best argument for the existence of God points squarely to the Christian God and therefore away from deism, in which case the idea of prayer has to be on the table. It's also here worth briefly noting that whilst I'm aware I've been a little bit rude about the lady asking for the details from my dad. I do acknowledge that if a Christian offers to pray for you, whilst I personally would find that quite uncomfortable, there's no getting around the fact that from their perspective, that's one of the kindest things they could do. So I'm not knocking any of that. I'm just trying to work this all out and figure out in my own head what actually makes sense to me. I think, therefore, that gives us the answers to those 4 questions above. So we had the first one of why would God change his mind just because we ask for something? And the answer to that would obviously be he doesn't change his mind at all. The second one would be, how could anyone ask for anything for themselves when there are always others to ask for? And this answer with that would seem to be, you're not supposed to ask for stuff for yourself. Other than presumably we can ask for our daily bread, being the basics of life presumably, to be saved from evil and to be kept from temptation, because Jesus, I understand, said to us that we could ask for that. The third question being, if God answers some prayers and not others, does that not just suggest he's operating on his own agenda? I think that becomes irrelevant because there's obviously no causal link between you asking for something and God doing it. Therefore, he hasn't changed his mind and he hasn't done something that he wasn't already going to do anyway. So it would suggest it's a mischaracterization of the question of what prayer is, something like that. And fourth, anyway, we have why does the format of prayer often differ from the Lord's Prayer? I presume that's because people kind of doing it wrong, which is a horrible thing to say when you're not a Christian and you're just critiquing from the outside, as it were, especially when you talk about my aunt, that sort of thing. But it does sound like that was the wrong thing to ask for, I think, maybe. Difficult to know. The formula, for want of a better word, surely therefore has to be, you don't ask for anything for yourself. It is a gratitude and humility ritual in the hope that we become a better person through doing it. And that's interesting, that, because that does raise the question, do you need to believe in God to pray? And it would seem the answer to that would probably be no. I was admittedly, I've been in church a few times lately, been trying it, and I don't pray along when they're doing their thing, not because I'm trying to be really difficult or unpleasant, and I feel a little bit awkward sometimes, as in feel awkward not doing it, but because it seems to me it's a little bit hypocritical and kind of mocking of everybody else who does believe it if I go along with it as well. So that's perhaps the wrong way to look at it. I fully acknowledge that. That's where the head's at. But it does seem perhaps, if that's right, that praying would make sense even if you don't believe in God. Perhaps I do need to rethink that. I think anyway that doing the work for this tangent has resolved, at least in my head, the problem of the existence of prayer, as it were, as in it could definitely make sense in some capacity, not asking for Lamborghinis, but other things it could make sense for. It does seem it is perhaps misunderstood to some extent, but it does make sense that it could be a very positive thing for the prayer, if not having any tangible benefit for the prayee. Well, that's whether or not God exists, actually. So clearly, it would seem that my work to do from here is to try and get a little bit less squirmy with it.